and welcome to More to the Story. Today, Michelle and I are super excited because we have Erwin Lutzer with us. And Erwin, I love the story of how God led you in such an unexpected way to Moody Church. Can you share that story with us?
Jeff, my whole life has been one marked by the providence of God. I attribute it to God, I attribute it to my parents. Somehow within my heart, as you've heard, I became a fan of Billy Graham, but also as a farm boy, I would run into the fields, look into the stars, and pray to God. Now, I mention that as background, and through a series of providences, which I will not go into, I was teaching in Canada. I was married by now. We came to the United States. I was going to go to a university out on the East Coast. Have never been there. And in the meantime, I became the pastor of a small Baptist church in Chicago, Edgewater Baptist, which was along the lake shore, and it was north of the main city. And I resigned in 1977 so that I could teach full-time at Moody Bible Institute. And also I was studying philosophy at Loyola University and needed to study for my comprehensives. So the last Sunday we are there is March of 1977, and they have a farewell for us, and everybody's sad to see us go, which is wonderful. It's always wonderful when a pastor leaves and the people are sad to see him go. There are some other stories, you know.
Yes.
So we wake up the next Sunday without a church to go to. I wanted to go to a different church, but Rebecca said, let's go to Moody Church, because I had known and came to know the pastor, who was Pastor Wiersbe at that time. Well, Jeff, I know that you are married. So I don't know how it is in your marriage, but I do know this, that whenever I hear the voice of God, it sounds an awful lot like Rebecca. So we ended up going to Moody Church. Now, we had only 2 children. This is 1977. And there's no parking around Moody Church, if you've ever been there. So I dropped her and the 2 children off. And I said, I'll meet you in the lobby later, but I don't know where I'm going to park because LaSalle Street is as tight as a drum. There is a parking lot about 3 blocks away, and I thought that I would park there. Well, wouldn't you know it, I still see it with such clarity. A man is walking across the street right in front of my car. He's fidgeting with his keys, taking them out of his pocket. He's getting into his vehicle, and he's driving away, and I back in, maybe 100 feet from the door. And I think, wow, that's really fortunate. I go find Rebecca in the lobby, and Wiersbe, the pastor, has his coat on, and he's leaving. I put my hand on his shoulder because I don't think he saw me, but I saw him. I said, Wiersbe, it's 10 minutes before the service. He said, I'm on my way home. I'm sick. I want you to preach for me this morning. So he took me to the back where the staff was, and he said, I want Erwin Lutzer to speak. He had asked an older man to regurgitate a Sunday school lesson. So that man was very glad that he didn't have to do that. And so I spoke at Moody Church. So the first time we ever attended a service at Moody Church, I preached at Moody Church. And standing on that platform and looking at this large congregation, this large church, I said to myself as a joke, if they ever call me to be the pastor, I'll say yes. But that was so unthinkable. That was just a thought that crossed my mind randomly. I preached on Psalm 1 because I had had a message on meditating in the law of God day and night. And I had preached it before. I wrote the outline on the back of an envelope. I wish I had kept that envelope. But at the time that these things are happening, you have no idea that they're going to have significance. So I preached at Moody Church on Psalm 1. On the way home, Rebecca and I had $5. I had $5 in my pocket. We stopped at a gas station, and In those days, the attendant put gas in, and I asked him to put in $5, and he put in $8. In those days, $8 bought a lot of gas. So I said, I'm really sorry, I only have 5. And he said, I know, it's my mistake, just give me a 5. So that night, Rebecca and I joked, we not only went to the right church, but we even stopped at the right gas station. Well, after that, everyone asked, well, who's this guy who just came in off the street who preached? So whenever Wiersbe was gone, he had me speak. And then when he resigned, eventually to go back to the Bible, the church voted to have me as interim. So I preached at Moody Church for nearly 2 years, almost every Sunday. I encouraged them to find as many candidates as they could. I didn't want them to have people say, well, they accepted Lutzer because after all, they were desperate and they just wanted to know. And you know how those churches are, the large churches. They have this person and that person. But the point is that I preached most of the Sundays. So by the end of 79, people in the congregation said they began a petition for the committee to say, don't you understand, God already brought our man. And at that point, we became serious. Now, Rebecca isn't here to defend herself, but she struggled with this because in her mind, she was thinking of what it was like to be the pastor's wife in a small church where you're expected to sing in the choir, you're expected to be involved in the nursery, and the idea of what would be expected of her was just overwhelming. But she didn't realize that in a large church, those expectations aren't there. So, thankfully, after much prayer, I became the pastor on January the 1st, 1980. And I thought to myself, you know, if I stay 5 years, that'll be fortunate. The pastor who stayed the least amount of time, his name was Franklin Logsden. He was a very good man, great preacher, but he was there only 18 months because he followed the famous pastor Harry Ironside, and the board didn't even want him at their meetings because they said Harry Ironside never attended meetings, he just preached. So eventually Logsden moved on. I did get to know him briefly, and that's why I know that side of the story. So I thought, with God's help, I'll get through the first 5 years. And they were difficult years because we let some staff members go, and you get criticism, and you know, leadership can be difficult business. Well, what happened is 5 years passed, my staff began to develop. I said, you know, I think I can do this for another 5. So it ended up being 36.
That's great.
And it was a great privilege. And I know that we're hopping ahead somewhat, but I transitioned in 2016 to become pastor emeritus. And the media ministry, Running to Win, which is our flagship radio program, I thought was going to come to an end quite soon. It has done nothing but expand. We're in 20 different countries in 4 different languages and going to expand even further this year. And of course, because of the internet, we're heard around the world. So I just marvel at God's unexpected, undeserved goodness. And it all has to do with God. And meanwhile, I also became a writer along the way. You know, there are those of us who think we have the gift of writing, but oftentimes we discover that few people have the gift of reading. But nonetheless, all these things have come together, and I give God the glory.
Wow, that's
What was one thing that you learned in all the years of being pastor that God taught you?
One of the reasons I want to encourage pastors is because I do want them to understand the providence of God, how God leads us in the ordinary decisions of life, even when we're unaware of it. But if you ask a different question on a practical level, what did I learn? I'm being vulnerable here, but I learned I cannot always trust my judgment of people. There were one or two people we hired back then in the 80s that I thought were perfect for the job, and they turned out to be not a good fit. And you know, when you're in ministry, when you have to let people go, it's very painful because it's not like business. I mean, these are brothers and sisters. Right. So what it reminded me of, and this maybe gets to the heart of your question, I believe very much in shared leadership among the elders. Because after that, I began to realize that the decisions I make for hiring should not really just be mine at all. What we need is the elder board's input, because other people can see in other people things that I might miss. And I might be impressed because of A, B, C, D, but there might be a downside. And I would say to pastors, speaking of leadership, when it comes to your elder board, be very careful as to who you have in those positions. Because that's the second lesson I learned. We had one or two elders, which I thought would be great for eldership. In at least one instance, it turned out not to be so. And I realized that the gatekeepers of a church should really be the elder board. Now, that doesn't mean you run every decision past them.
Right.
But I always felt myself responsible to the elder board. I was not a lone pastor who is getting my messages from God unfiltered. It was a matter of shared leadership within the church. And I'm troubled today because there are many churches where the pastor is the king, so to speak, and I know for sure that he can make mistakes, and then he begins to justify himself, and he begins to criticize others, and so forth. So that's definitely one lesson I learned. And so, to put it maybe in different words, it's sure a lot easier to hire than it is to fire. So, who you have in leadership is incredibly important.
How has your preaching changed over the years?
Well, through the providence of God, Jeff, I just can't get over God's goodness. It blows me away. Before I became the pastor, there was a man who taught preaching up at Trinity Seminary. We happened to meet. He said, "Erwin, let's have coffee together." And he, in 15 minutes, changed my preaching. And here, I was a graduate of Dallas Seminary. I had Haddon Robinson as my teacher. And yet, when I became a pastor and my preaching, I found it so hard to have an outline that had unity, order, and progress. You begin here, but there's a sense of unity that follows along, because there's a lot of preaching out there, which all may be good, except that it's over here, it's over here, it's over here, and it may be generally related. So the goal that I always have is the transformation of life. In fact, when I taught preaching to seminary students, I used to tell them, the purpose of the Bible was not given for us to study. You know, their eyes, well, what in the world am I doing here? What I said is, it is given to us to study so that we can better understand God, better instruct people, because we're always moving toward life change. See, my chief gift is not teaching. My chief gift is exhortation. Exhorters always want to see life change. Those who have the gift of teaching, oftentimes they're satisfied with content. You know, ram it in, cram it in, people's heads are hollow. Ram it in, cram it in, make sure there's more to follow. So as long as I give you this content, that's fine. They don't see the need for application, for transformation. And then on the other hand, you have those who maybe are interested only in transformation and they don't have good content. So there has to be a balance. But I love to get pastors together and teach them what I learned about preaching. And since you've asked the question, I think I can say this, though others should be the judge, that my ministry always has been with the objective of taking scriptural truth, but bridging that gap to life and seeing transformation. I remember preparing messages, and I would say to myself, why should anybody's life be changed forever because they've heard this sermon? So getting that balance right, and I'm not saying that I necessarily did, but that's the balance for which we aim.
Thanks for joining us today. If you would like to hear more stories, just click on the link nearby. You can also download our free John Ankerberg Show app and get more resources on there.